Think about the last time you just scrolled through your feed.
Oh, yeah. Which is probably about 5 minutes ago for most of us.
Right, exactly. And you see a scandal unfolding, or some major conflict breaking out, or even just a really intense localized debate between two people you know online.
And you immediately feel that pressure.
Yes. Within maybe 30 seconds of exposure, you probably felt this immense, almost suffocating pressure to just instantly take an X-ray of the situation, to declare exactly who was broken, what the motives were, and, assign absolute blame.
It's like a reflex at this point.
It really is. In our current digital environment, there's this very real expectation that you need to have a fully formed, ironclad opinion on incredibly complex issues almost immediately.
Whether it's global politics or just social drama.
Exactly. And to say, I don't know yet well, it's practically treated as a moral failing. We are demanded to be instant judges.
Which is terrifying when you really think about it.
It is. So consider the sheer weight of making a judgment. Consider what happens when you snap that gavel down on a situation you barely understand. What if that instinct to judge rapidly, the very thing society praises as being, informed or engaged, is exactly what's blinding you to reality?
That's the core issue, right? That pressure to instantly categorize the world is one of the most defining and, frankly, most dangerous psychological features of modern life.
Because we just hate the unknown.
Exactly. We crave the comfort of immediate certainty. Ambiguity feels like a threat, so we rush to resolve it by forming an opinion. But today's deep dive is going to fundamentally challenge that entire reflex.
I am so ready for this.
We are dissecting Chapter 31 of a really dense foundational philosophical text, Morals and Dogma. The chapter is titled The Inspector Inquisitor.
Which is quite the title.
It is, and the mission here is to reverse engineer the actual mechanics of how we form judgments. We're looking for an intellectual toolkit to help you navigate this high-speed, information-heavy world.
Without falling into all those pervasive traps of error, or unconscious bias, or that seductive rush to absolute certainty.
Precisely.
Now, to give you a sense of where we are in the architecture of this specific source material, we need to look at the thematic bridge.
Right, because context is everything here.
Always. So, in the previous exploration, Chapter 30, the text focused intensely on outward external virtues. It was dealing with courage, with justice, with action.
How you interact with the physical world.
Yeah, exactly. It was about how you swing the sword in the arena of the world. But here in Chapter 31, there is a hard, deliberate pivot.
We're no longer talking about the arm that swings the sword.
No, we are suddenly talking about the internal architecture of the mind that decides whether that sword should even be drawn in the first place.
It's a total shift. The focus moves inward and upward.
Right. It's an entire chapter dedicated to the internal responsibility of seeing truth clearly before you even think about acting on it.
And the central thesis of the chapter establishes a baseline that most of us, honestly, rarely stop to consider. True judgment is not a casual mental reflex.
It's treated like one today, though.
Oh, absolutely. But the text argues it is a heavy, almost overwhelming responsibility. It demands an absolute commitment to understanding a thing completely before drawing a conclusion about it.
And it pairs that demand with a radical kind of internal humility.
Right. And the reason it places such a massive burden on the act of judging is because judgment is basically the bedrock of reality creation.
Reality creation. I like that.
Yeah. It acts as the unshakable foundation for our perceptions, our subsequent decisions, and ultimately our concrete actions in the real world.
So I want to linger on that title for a moment, The Inspector Inquisitor. Because when I first read those words, my mind immediately went to, like, a medieval history textbook.
Sure, you picture the Spanish Inquisition.
Exactly. You picture someone in a dark robe in a damp cellar, demanding confessions, looking to punish. It sounds very external and very aggressive.
But as you dig into the mechanics of the text, it turns out to be an entirely internal operation.
Right. The inspector is not interrogating someone else. The inspector is auditing their own mind.
Yeah, the etymology and the philosophical intent here are completely divorced from the historical baggage of the word inquisitor. To inspect simply means to look into carefully.
And to inquire means to ask questions, to seek deeper context.
Exactly. So in the framework of this chapter, the title represents a profound internal duty. The inspector must evaluate the world carefully precisely because they understand the downstream consequences of their own conclusions.
Because when you judge a situation, You pour the concrete foundation upon which all your future interactions with that situation will be built.
That's a great way to put it. If that foundation is crooked, every floor built on top of it will lean.
Let's visualize the physics of that consequence for a second. Think of the act of making a judgment, like turning the steering wheel of a massive ocean liner.
Okay, I'm with you.
You're navigating open water. Every microscopic turn of that wheel, your initial judgment, shifts the entire trajectory of the ship.
Right, even just a tiny nudge.
Exactly. If you are off by a single degree when you leave the port in New York, you might not notice the error for the first few hundred miles. The water looks the same.
But that tiny error compounds.
It compounds over thousands of miles, and instead of landing in London, you end up freezing off the coast of Greenland.
That's a brilliant analogy. That 1 degree of initial flawed judgment compounds over time until your perceived reality is completely divorced from actual truth.
And that compounding error is exactly what makes the rush to judgment so lethal.
Right. It really is. And there is a psychological mechanism at play here that the text explicitly warns against. A single solidified judgment actively closes off all other possibilities of perception.
Because human beings are cognitive misers.
Right. Our brains want to conserve energy. So once we judge something, once we put a label on an event or a person and shove it in a mental filing cabinet, we literally stop actively observing it.
The brain just says, case closed, I understand this, move on to the next threat.
Exactly. Observation dies the moment judgment is finalized.
So if I label a coworker as, lazy, based on just one single interaction.
Which happens all the time.
All the time.
Mm.
But if I do that, I am effectively turning off my ability to see any data that contradicts that label.
You become entirely blind to the contradiction. If you judge them as lazy, every subsequent action they take is filtered through that specific lens.
So if they are resting, it confirms my judgment.
Right. And if they are working incredibly hard on a complex project, your brain just rationalizes it to protect your initial judgment.
Oh, wow. So I'd assume they're just putting on a show for management.
Or that they're only doing it because they were threatened with termination. The judgment becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in your own mind because it literally dictates the boundaries of your perception.
And the inspector archetype in this text understands this terrifying mechanic.
Yes. They know that the act of bringing the gavel down ends the investigation. Therefore, the core discipline of the inspector is to delay bringing that gavel down for as long as humanly possible.
So if judgment is the steering wheel that directs our actions and determines our final destination, then awareness has to be the windshield we are looking out of.
I like where you're going with this.
You cannot steer a ship or a car accurately if your vision is blocked or if the glass is warped or if it's covered in mud.
Not without crashing, anyway.
Right. You can have the best intentions in the world, but if you can't see the road, you are going to crash.
And the text is uncompromising on this sequence. Clear judgment strictly begins with awareness. It cannot emerge from anywhere else.
It has to be the first step.
Absolutely. The text defines this required awareness as observing accurately, gathering wide context, and crucially fighting the urge to stop at mere appearances.
Because perception forms the raw material of judgment.
Exactly. If the raw material is corrupted, the final product is corrupted.
I want to dive into the mechanics of how that corruption happens, because it's not usually some dramatic, malicious failure. It's a failure of mechanics.
Very true. It's usually subtle.
Think about a camera lens. If you are trying to take a picture in a really chaotic environment, you can use a very narrow aperture.
Okay.
A narrow aperture brings one single object in the foreground into razor-sharp focus, but it completely blurs out the entire background. The background just becomes this muddy, unrecognizable smear of colors.
Yeah, it's a great visual.
So if our awareness operates like a narrow aperture, we might see the immediate action, someone yelling, for example, in sharp focus, but the entire background context of why they are yelling is completely blurred out of our reality.
And then we judge the sharp image and ignore the blur.
Exactly.
That is the exact distinction the text makes between passive seeing and active observation. The passive observer accepts the narrow aperture.
They just take what's easy to see.
Right. They see the surface layer, the yelling, and immediately generate a judgment. This is a hostile, irrational person.
Key closed.
Exactly. But the active observer, the inspector, recognizes that the narrow aperture is dangerously misleading. They look at the sharp image of the anger and recognize it as merely an appearance. It's just a surface symptom.
So what do?
They actively force the aperture wide open to bring the background into focus. They ask the necessary questions.
Like, what is the environmental pressure creating this symptom?
Yes. Are they grieving a loss we don't know about?
Yeah.
Are they backed into a corner terrified for their livelihood? Are they defending someone else?
Okay, I have to challenge the practicality of this, though. I want to push back a little.
Go for it.
Opening the aperture takes time, and it requires light, meaning it requires access to actual information.
Okay.
It is very easy to sit in a philosophical vacuum and declare, you must understand the full context before judging. But in the reality of our messy, high-friction daily lives, we virtually never have access to the full context of any situation.
We almost always have incomplete data.
Exactly. You get a fragmented snapshot. You hear a 10-second audio clip out of a 2-hour meeting. You get one highly emotional side of a story from a friend over coffee.
Right.
How on earth is this Inspector Inquisitor supposed to operate when the picture is inherently, unavoidably incomplete?
Right.
We cannot paralyze ourselves waiting for omniscience. We still have to navigate the world and make decisions.
That friction, that tension between the ideal of total context and the reality of fragmented information is the absolute crucible of the inspector's discipline.
Because you can't just wait forever.
No, and the text does not demand omniscience. It doesn't suggest you need to possess every atom of data in the universe before you decide to cross a conceptual street.
Okay, that's a relief.
What it demands is the active, conscious recognition of the missing data. When you say we only get a snapshot, the discipline of the inspector is to consciously label it as a snapshot.
Oh, I see.
The fatal danger is not in possessing incomplete information. We all possess incomplete information all the time. The fatal danger is in treating incomplete information as if it is the comprehensive whole.
So the error isn't the lack of context itself. The error is the arrogant delusion that we already have all the context we need to make a final ruling.
Precisely that delusion. When you receive that 10-second audio clip, the passive mind says, I have heard the evidence, I know the truth.
Right. I saw the clip on Twitter. I know exactly what happened.
Exactly. But the inspector's mind says, I have heard a fragment. I will hold this fragment, but I will not build a final judgment upon it until I map the surrounding silence.
Map the surrounding silence.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
You don't have to know the answer immediately, but the very act of asking the question, the very act of acknowledging the blur in the background, prevents you from making a catastrophic, irreversible error in judgment based on a superficial reading of appearances.
But constantly labeling your own reality as incomplete requires an enormous amount of cognitive stamina.
It is exhausting.
It really is to live in a state of continuous inquiry. And this leads directly into the next major hurdle the text throws at us.
The internal tint.
Yes. Even if we make the commitment to actively look for context, even if we try to manually open that camera aperture, the windshield of our awareness is still tinted. And the tint is entirely of our own making.
It's the architecture of our own minds.
Right. This internal tint is what the text identifies as the ultimate distorter of understanding. Personal bias.
Bias is the silent, invisible architect of error. The text lays down a very strict mandate here. The inspector must rigorously audit their personal assumptions, actively fight the gravitational pull toward quick conclusions, and relentlessly seek a state of objectivity and neutrality.
Which means the outward observation turns into heavy, often painful internal work.
Exactly. You are no longer just examining the world, you are examining the lens through which you view the world.
And fighting that pull toward a quick conclusion feels almost biological. It feels like trying to consciously suppress a physical reflex, like trying not to pull your hand away from a hot stove.
Because it is biological, in a way.
From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, our brains are hardwired to snap to a judgment to save our lives.
Fight or flight.
Yeah. If our ancestors saw a sudden movement in the tall grass, they didn't pause to do a deep, multivariate contextual analysis of wind patterns and the migratory habits of local fauna.
They would have been eaten.
Exactly.
Huh?
They assumed it was a predator, and they ran. The brain developed a hyper-fast autofill feature. Bias is essentially the mental algorithm guessing the end of the sentence before the environment has even finished speaking. It wants to give us a complete picture instantly so we can survive.
Understanding the mechanical nature of bias is so crucial, and that autofill concept captures it perfectly. We tend to moralize bias.
We do. We think of it purely as a character flaw.
Right, like a sign of being a bad or prejudiced person. But at its foundational neurological level, it is just an efficiency mechanism that is misfiring in a modern context.
Because the brain wants to conserve metabolic energy.
Exactly. Processing new, complex, ambiguous information runs an enormous amount of energy. So the brain relies on past experiences, cultural programming, and emotional preferences to fill in the blanks instantly. It grabs whatever template is closest at hand.
But the modern world isn't the savannah.
That's the severe problem we face today. Modern social, professional, and ethical dilemmas are not rustling bushes. They are highly intricate, multi-layered webs of human motivation. They require deep nuance, not an ancient fight-or-flight categorization.
So if this autofill feature is hardwired into our neurological hardware, how does the inspector actually neutralize it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Does this philosophical text expect us to somehow transcend our own biology and magically become blank slates? Because striving to have zero assumptions sounds like an impossible, frustrating fantasy.
The text is actually deeply practical about this. It knows we are human, and it does not ask for a blank slate. You cannot erase the hardware.
Thank goodness.
Instead, it demands that we consciously drag those assumptions out of the subconscious shadow and into the glaring light of the conscious mind.
You can't defuse a bomb if you refuse to acknowledge it's in the room.
Exactly. True judgment requires neutrality, but the text frames neutrality not as a natural state of being, but as a deliberate, highly practiced state of suspension.
A suspension of the instinct.
Right. It is the active discipline of holding back the mind's desperate desire to jump to the finish line. When you feel that autofill kicking in when you read a headline and feel that sudden, intoxicating rush of righteous certainty that you know exactly who the villain is.
We all know that rush.
We do. But that specific emotional rush is the alarm bell. That is the exact moment the inspector must throw up a cognitive roadblock.
Man, this is a terrifyingly difficult, actionable insight. It requires us to learn to sit in the incredibly uncomfortable, vulnerable space of not knowing yet.
And society hates that space.
We absolutely despise that space as a culture. If you are at a dinner party or in a boardroom and someone asks your opinion on a volatile current event, replying with, "I don't know yet, I'm still gathering information and checking my own biases," it's often perceived as a social failure.
It's viewed as weakness or ignorance or lack of conviction.
Exactly. We are heavily conditioned to believe that an immediate, forceful opinion is the primary indicator of intelligence and leadership.
But the text is arguing the precise opposite.
Right. Rushing to the comfort of a biased, prepackaged conclusion is the ultimate sign of intellectual cowardice. Sitting in the agonizing discomfort of not knowing yet is the true hallmark of the inspector.
And when you successfully suppress that urge to make a quick biased conclusion, you create a void. You hold open an empty space in your mind where a rushed judgment would normally sit like a concrete block.
So what do you do with that void?
The critical question then becomes, what do you fill that empty space with? You can't just leave it empty forever.
Right. You eventually have to make a decision.
Exactly. The text provides the structural answer. You fill it with careful, deliberate, multi-dimensional analysis.
Depth over speed.
Yeah.
That is the operational protocol. The mechanics of the Inspector Inquisitor, before they ever allow the gavel to fall, involve a rigorous phase of gathering raw information.
Yes, actively evaluating evidence and intentionally mapping out multiple perspectives.
We really need to put a microscope on that phrase, evaluating evidence.
Yeah.
Because in our daily lives, we use the word evidence incredibly loosely.
Oh, totally. We usually use it to describe any piece of information that conveniently supports what we already secretly want to believe.
Confirmation bias is our default setting.
It is. But true evaluation in the framework of the inspector means treating your own initial perceptions not as facts to be defended, but as fragile hypotheses to be aggressively tested.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Treating a perception as a hypothesis.
It completely changes how you interact with your own thoughts.
So instead of experiencing a negative interaction and immediately concluding this person is fundamentally toxic and acting maliciously to undermine me, you force yourself to say, my current hypothesis is that this person is acting maliciously.
Right. You detach from it.
Now, as the inspector, it is my duty to actively search for evidence that proves my own hypothesis wrong. You literally have to play defense attorney for the person you want to convict.
Exactly. And that requires an unnatural rotation of perspective. You have to look at the issue from multiple, sometimes wildly opposing angles to build a three-dimensional model of truth.
It's like a geometry problem.
It really is. Consider the geometry of perspective. If you place a cylinder on a table and you only look at it from directly above,
It looks like a circle.
right, your eyes will tell you with absolute certainty that you are looking at a flat, two-dimensional circle. You have visual evidence. You are completely convinced.
But it's not a circle.
No,
Yeah.
because if you force yourself to walk around to the side of the table and look at it from eye level, it suddenly looks like a flat rectangle.
Wow.
You didn't have the wrong information initially. You simply didn't have the varied perspectives required to comprehend the object's true three-dimensional shape.
So evaluating evidence means actively seeking out the side of the cylinder you cannot currently see.
Exactly. Even when your brain is screaming that it's obviously just a circle.
I see the geometric logic, but let me play the pragmatist here again.
Do you do?
In a world that financially and socially rewards hot takes, rapid-fire decision-making, and first-mover advantage, how does an individual practically cultivate this habit of depth over speed without getting completely run over?
It's a very real concern.
Doesn't taking the time to gather multiple perspectives,
Mm.
to meticulously evaluate evidence, to test your own perceptions as hypotheses, doesn't that guarantee you'll be the last person to speak in a meeting?
Almost certainly.
Doesn't it leave you falling behind the cultural conversation? Speed is treated as the ultimate metric of competence right now.
The text anticipates this exact friction between worldly demands and the pursuit of truth, and it forces us to recognize a very hard, immutable reality. Speed is the mortal enemy of truth.
Speed is the enemy of truth.
The modern ecosystem may reward the fastest hot take with attention or temporary status, but the universe itself operates strictly on reality.
So the bill always comes due.
Always. You can make a very fast, very popular, but fundamentally flawed judgment, and you will inevitably have to deal with the very real, very slow, very agonizing consequences of that error when it collides with reality.
And the inspector understands this asymmetry.
Therefore, the inspector is perfectly willing to be the last person in the room to form an opinion, the last person to speak, if it means that the opinion, when finally formed, is structurally sound.
Being willingly, intentionally the last person to form an opinion. That requires dismantling almost everything we are taught about looking smart.
It requires a total reorientation of values. The inspector knows that a conclusion reached through shallow speed is as fragile as glass.
The moment it encounters real resistance,
Or contradictory facts, or just the complexities of human nature, it shatters. And when it shatters, you have to clean up the mess and start over anyway, which wastes far more time in the long run.
right, so fast is actually slow.
Exactly. A conclusion built on depth, on the painful, slow process of evaluating evidence and walking around the cylinder to see all the angles, is robust. It can withstand the pressure of reality because it is built from reality.
So let's say we have done the grueling work. We have held off on the quick conclusion. We have manually opened the aperture of our awareness. We have gathered opposing perspectives. We have rigorously analyzed the evidence and treated our perceptions as hypotheses.
We did all the homework.
Right. But what happens when that deep analysis reveals that our initial, deeply held assumptions were completely embarrassingly wrong?
It hurts.
Or worse, what if we do all that intense analytical work and the evidence is just a chaotic mess and the situation remains totally inconclusive?
That might be even harder to accept.
This brings us to the threshold of what is arguably the most difficult psychological requirement laid out in the text, the absolute necessity of humility.
Humility is the hinge upon which this entire philosophy turns. Without it, the analysis just becomes a tool for sophisticated arrogance.
Just a way to sound smart while being wrong.
Right. The text's assertion that no one knows everything seems deceptively simple on the surface. We can all nod along to it and say, of course, nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes.
That's a nice bumper sticker.
Exactly. But the practical daily application of this principle is agonizing for the human ego. The inspector must remain genuinely humble, must be openly willing to accept public correction, and, most terrifyingly, must make peace with permanent uncertainty.
I want to dissect how humility actually functions as a mechanical tool to improve judgment, because our cultural definition of humility is honestly terrible.
It really is.
We tend to equate humility with weakness, subservience, or indecisiveness. We think being humble means you lack a spine, that you never take a firm stand on anything.
But the mechanics laid out here suggest something entirely different.
Right, they suggest that absolute certainty is actually a defensive mask worn by ignorance.
That is a vital distinction. An open mind is not an empty, spineless mind. It is a highly active, dynamic mind. Humility is the functional engine that allows for continuous data gathering.
Because if you're certain, you stop looking.
The moment you declare yourself absolutely certain about a complex issue, you shut down the sensory intake valves. You stop listening to contrary evidence, you stop observing nuance, you stop learning.
So certainty is basically a wall.
Certainty is a brick wall you build around your current limited level of understanding, actively preventing any new data from getting inside. Humility is simply keeping the door propped open so the data can continue to flow.
Let's use an analogy to ground the difference between these two mindsets. It's the fundamental difference between operating like a scientist versus operating like a lawyer.
Oh, I love this comparison.
When a lawyer walks into a courtroom, they already know the exact outcome they're being paid to achieve. They argue to prove they are right from the absolute start.
They aren't there to discover truth.
No, they selectively present only the evidence that supports their narrative, and they actively, aggressively try to discredit, hide, or destroy any evidence that contradicts it. Their ultimate goal is winning the argument, not necessarily discovering the objective truth of the event.
The lawyer operates entirely on defensive bias. Their judgment was finalized before they even entered the room.
Exactly. But a true scientist operates on a completely different psychological protocol. A scientist sets up the experiment, gathers the data, and humbly accepts whatever the data tells them, even if it completely obliterates their favorite pet theory.
Even if it wrecks their life's work.
Even if it means 20 years of their academic career was based on a flawed premise. For the lawyer, losing the argument is a total failure. But for the scientist, a ruined theory is not a failure. It's a massive success.
Because they have successfully eliminated an untruth.
Right. And moved one measurable step closer to actual reality. The inspector must act like the scientist, never the lawyer.
And operating like that scientist requires a monumental daily level of ego suppression. It means divorcing your sense of self-worth from your initial opinions.
Which is incredibly hard when our opinions are our identities online.
Exactly. Accepting uncertainty isn't a failure of your analytical abilities. Sometimes it is the most highly accurate judgment one can possibly make about a chaotic world.
To just say, I don't know.
Yes. To look at a highly volatile, complex situation, review the fragmented evidence, and definitively state out loud, there is simply not enough reliable information here to make a sound judgment, is an act of profound, courageous wisdom.
It protects you and everyone around you from the collateral damage of acting on confident falsehoods.
Which brings us into the final, transcendent phase of this entire intellectual operation.
The ultimate goal.
When you combine that relentless, deep analysis, when you forge the immense emotional patience to avoid the quick, biased conclusion, and you wield the radical humility to accept correction over time, something incredible happens to the information you've gathered.
It undergoes a kind of philosophical alchemy.
It transforms from mere data gathering into the ultimate goal of the chapter, wisdom.
The text draws a very sharp, deliberate line separating information, knowledge, and wisdom, doesn't it?
It does, and it's so relevant today. We currently live in the information age, which means we are drowning in a massive surplus of disconnected facts and data points.
Just an ocean of noise.
Right. Knowledge is the secondary step. It is the structural organization of those facts into coherent patterns. But the text defines wisdom as something far rarer.
How does it define it?
Wisdom is the synthesis of knowledge, tempered by lived experience and refined by deep, quiet reflection.
Like the difference between reading a manual and actually doing the work.
Exactly. You can possess all the technical knowledge in the world about the thermodynamics of a combustion engine, but without the physical experience and the reflection of past failures, you aren't wise enough to actually fix a broken-down car on the side of a busy highway in the freezing rain.
So knowledge is knowing how the pieces fit together. But wisdom is understanding how those pieces interact with the chaotic reality of the physical world.
It requires the application of knowledge through the filter of lived experience.
And we have to connect this concept of wisdom directly back to the very beginning of our exploration today. The heavy responsibility of the gavel.
The downstream consequences.
Right. Because judgment leads to real-world consequences that affect human lives, the wise inspector takes total ownership of their decisions. They don't just issue a judgment from an ivory tower and walk away, insulated from the fallout.
They deeply empathetically understand the impact of their conclusions on the people around them and the systems they operate within.
And because of that deep empathy, they constantly strive for the ideal of fairness.
But we need to define fairness here.
Yeah, I want to push back on this concept of fairness, actually. Is fairness some objective, mathematical standard floating out there in the cosmos that we are desperately trying to align our judgments with?
That's how we often treat it.
Right. Or Is fairness simply the natural, inevitable byproduct of rigorously executing all the steps we just outlined? If I diligently practice opening the aperture of awareness, if I aggressively analyze the evidence against my own bias, if I remain scientifically humble, does fairness just naturally fall out the other end of that machine?
That is the ultimate philosophical extrapolation of this entire chapter, and it is a brilliant question.
Well, thank you.
The text strongly suggests that true judgment isn't about being right in some absolute, infallible, cosmic sense. It is not about reaching a state of flawless, rigid certainty.
So what is the goal then?
The ultimate goal of the inspector is achieving profound understanding. If your primary goal is to simply be right and win the argument, you will almost always end up being unfair.
Because you'll force the outcome.
Right. You will violently force the complex reality of human beings to fit into your rigid, predetermined parameters. But if your primary goal is comprehensive understanding, fairness naturally emerges as a byproduct.
Wow.
Fairness is the inevitable result of seeing the whole picture, recognizing all the messy, contradictory human elements involved, and making a decision that accounts for the full complexity of reality rather than reducing it to a binary.
Understanding over certainty. That is a massive paradigm shift.
It completely changes the definition of success in any intellectual or interpersonal endeavor.
It means the goal line isn't a period at the end of a definitive sentence. It's a comma. It's an ongoing, humble dialogue with reality.
Precisely. The burden of consequence, the weight of that gavel is incredibly heavy, but wisdom makes it bearable.
Because you aren't pretending to be a god.
Exactly. The wise inspector knows they are still human. They know they might still make a mistake despite all their rigorous processes.
But they're prepared for it.
Right, because they have operated with wide awareness, analytical depth, and an open door of humility, they retain the ability to smoothly course-correct the moment new evidence arrives, without their fragile ego shattering into a million pieces.
Man, we have covered an immense landscape of internal architecture today.
It's a lot to process.
It is. We've navigated the dangerous weight of the gavel, the necessity of widening the aperture of awareness, the biological trap of the autofill bias, the geometry of deep analysis, the ego death of humility, and the final alchemy of wisdom.
The full journey of the inspector.
As we prepare to close out this session, I want to present you, the listener, with a few direct reflection questions. These are inspired by the core challenges of the text we've been exploring. Consider these a diagnostic test for your own internal Inspector Inquisitor.
These reflections are where the philosophy moves from abstract theory into the friction of your actual daily life.
The rubber meeting the road.
It is the test of whether we are willing to apply the text or if we just enjoyed listening to the concepts.
Right, so first, how do you personally form your opinions? I want you to think about the last time you formed a very strong, unshakable opinion about a person or a public event.
A really firm one.
Did you genuinely take the time to map out the context, to walk around the cylinder and view it from the other side? Or did you react quickly, letting the autofill algorithm run based on an initial emotional surge?
It's a tough question to answer, honestly.
And honestly, how aware are you of your own internal tint? When was the last time you actively identified a deeply held assumption you possessed and consciously chose to set it aside so you could look at contradictory evidence without getting defensive?
The path of the Inspector Inquisitor is not a certificate you earn once and hang on your wall. It is an active, demanding, daily psychological practice.
Every single day.
It is the perpetual practice of wide awareness, of thoughtful, delayed judgment, and the relentless pursuit of deeper understanding over cheap certainty. It is a commitment to walking through the world with your eyes forcefully held open and your ego intentionally kept in check.
It is the difference between letting your mind drift on biological autopilot and actively gripping the steering wheel of your own perception.
Beautifully said.
Speaking of where this ship is heading next, I want to give you a brief look at the horizon. In our next deep dive, we will be exploring the text of Chapter 32, titled The Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret.
Oh, that is going to be a fascinating one.
It really is. This is the pinnacle where we look at how ultimate understanding, unity, and higher truth all synthesize. It is the grand culmination of everything we have been building toward in these explorations of virtue and judgment.
It is going to be a staggering exploration of how all these individual internal tools we've discussed finally forge a unified, coherent perspective on reality itself.
But before we arrive at that peak, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week.
Let's hear it.
We started this entire deep dive talking about the metaphorical X-ray, the intense cultural desire for instant, clear-cut, binary certainty in a world that is fundamentally messy.
The rush to the gavel.
Right. We talked about how we are socially pressured to bring the gavel down immediately just to prove we are engaged and informed. But based on the rigorous mechanics the text has laid out for us today, if true judgment is ultimately about profound understanding rather than rigid certainty,
Then what?
then perhaps the ultimate sign of a wise inspector isn't the unyielding strength of their convictions. Perhaps the truest measure of wisdom isn't how fiercely you could defend your initial opinion, but the number of times you possess the quiet, unshakable courage to completely change your own mind when reality presents you with a broader context.
A profound challenge to carry forward into the noise of the world.
Until next time, keep investigating the world around you, but more importantly, keep rigorously investigating the lens through which you see it.